Yeah, and we are live. Welcome, Jan. Welcome, Yuri. Happy to have you here in this already 21st Power Webinar. And we let the people come in. So please join us for the first minutes. And as soon as we have everyone, we start this webinar about the imbalance between humans and nature. Yuri, your third time doing it.
I'm addicted.
You're addicted. It's a drug for you.
Yep.
A natural drug, or is it a more pharmaceutical drug?
It's all organic, plant-based.
Organic. And Jan, it's for you the first time. Happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm curious.
You are curious? We will take you and all the participants on a journey, 90 minutes, a deep dive about that imbalance. And of course, Jan, to start with you, you are for, I think, whole Holland, the pioneer on climate change. You are the first graduate on that particular. Let's just start. Let's just start this webinar, because I would love to go back to your start. When was that? It was a master, was it?
Yes, actually, it was 30 years ago. So I did my PhD on a climate change model called IMAGE that's still being further developed. And before that, my master already 35 years ago on the same topic. Yeah. So I dived into climate change and later on sustainable development, and then transitions the way to. And well, I've been fascinated all my life by complexity, complex processes. And that's what we need now also, facing this crisis. So one of my specialties is how to deal with crisis, in particular systemic crisis. You want me to continue with that?
For sure, because I'm very curious. I still remember climate change when you first graduated on that. Nobody believed you. Huh?
Well, that's correct. Even my committee was doubtful because they said it's fascinating research into perhaps a non-existing topic at that time. So I didn't get any cum laude degree. There was high controversy within the committee. But I was glad with it and I believed in it. And I made all kinds of projections for the next 50, 100 years. And with hindsight, it appeared that I was too optimistic that time. If you look at the real observations regarding climate change, temperature increase and precipitation and sea level rise, then it goes 2-3 times faster than I projected at that time. So that's fascinating to see. And that was for me also one of the reasons to initiate an urgent agenda. And that group of people, activists, became a little famous in the Netherlands and outside because they sued the state of the Netherlands 5 years ago. And we won. And we won again in higher appeal and in the highest appeal. So we forced the state of the Netherlands to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 25%.
Unbelievable. Thank you, Jan. For the people who are joining now, we just did a little introduction with Professor Jan Rotmans, professor in sustainable transition. Yuri, your third time in this webinar, and for people who don't know Yuri, he's the co-author of the best-selling. Is it New York Times best-selling book or Amazon or yeah? It's the best-selling book of all times, Exponential Organizations. And we are, of course, curious what you are doing now at this moment. Tell me more. Tell the people more.
Well, I brought Singularity University to the Benelux 4 years ago, and I launched my book with Salim Ismail, Peter Diamandis, and Mike Malone 6 years ago called Exponential Organizations, which is now the top 10 business book of all times in terms of book sales. I've just heard from Salim. So that's pretty good. Recently, I moved to a different space because I don't want to repeat myself. Did a lot of personal transformation work myself, awareness, self-awareness, spiritual journeys, consciousness. But also I launched a few new initiatives. One is about the board motor. It's a Dutch open source movement for increased social cohesion. So we will retrain 1 million people in the next 10 years. We launched that 3 years ago with, let's say, the Dutch political and business elite involved actively. I also launched, co-founded a Conscious Learning Tribe recently. It's about the new world after Corona. So it's about ecological and social inclusiveness and a higher level of consciousness beneath to help solve these different two challenges. And also I'm involved with Jan. Jan, he launched a breakout team to help stabilize the pandemic in Holland. So that's a side project as well.
Beautiful. There's a lot happening this year, Jan, as we all know, not only in the speaking event industry. There's a future in front of us. But what's your experience? What's your feeling when this happened?
Well, if you look at the deepest level behind this crisis, then you see that it has a systemic character. So that means that it deeply affects the vital systems that we have, like energy, food, mobility, and education, that the indirect impact is bigger than the direct impact, and that it always leads to a kind of a recession. And I already projected decades ago that we will run into a series of crises with a systemic character. And the next one, I think, will be the climate crisis. And the point is, for me, these crises are a blessing in disguise. If you look at it at a personal level, it's quite a tragedy for many people. I see that, I feel that. But if you look at the systemic level, you see that we apparently need those crises in order to learn from them and to change our behavior. We are quite stubborn. 90% of our behavior is day-to-day routine behavior. And we need those crises in order to radically change. And after each systemic crisis, you see a bigger group of people taking a different road. It's not the case that after this crisis, the whole world will change. But let's say after each crisis, we see a certain group of people, 5-10%, that is changing their behavior. And also we see those changes at the systemic level. Until we reach the 25%.
Only 5%.
Yeah, at most, because our daily behavior is deeply rooted into routines. And we do the things because we are used to do them. That's how it works. So we will, again, be, let's say, mobile and be flying all over the world. But a certain group of people now says, this is the limit. And each crisis helps to make that group bigger. Until we have reached the 25%, we call that a tipping point. From all kinds of transition studies, it appears if you reach the tipping point of 25%, then the remaining 75% goes relatively fast. That is how a transition evolves. It's a highly non-linear process. It always begins with front runners, and then the front runners of the peloton, and then the big peloton, the mass, and then the laggards. And yeah, now my best guess is that we have reached now, let's say, the 10-15% of the people globally. So we are heading for that tipping point the next 10 years. That's my assumption.
We have now 80 more minutes. Can we solve it in this 80 more minutes? Yeah.
Well, we within our community now probably, but to do that at a global scale, that's more difficult. And the reason is that each transition goes along with a shift in power, and many people are afraid to lose power from, let's say, the vested interest. So a transition is not always a rosy process. It's quite a whimsical process. There is a group that has the power, and there is a group that wants to have that power. So it is driven by technological breakthroughs, by institutional breakthroughs, economic ones, but also mental ones. And the mental ones are the most difficult to handle. Deep down inside, we have a certain fear for transformative change, because we are afraid of losing our job or status or ego or our, let's say, main human and worldview. And you need to go through these layers. And the last couple of years, I focused on these personal transitions. So the big systemic transition in our vital systems, mobility, energy, and food, and education, and healthcare, they are driven by personal transitions. If we do not make that personal transition, we are also blocking the systemic transition. So being a mathematician, for me, that was also difficult. I needed a personal crisis, a heavy biking accident, to go through a personal transition myself. So often people need personal crisis in order to, let's say, realize a breakthrough.
I totally understand. I'm connected with a lot of people in experience what you had, a deep dive. Something happened in their life, and then an awakening, as we call it, from this is not the life where we all want to live in. We see the planet, the pollution everywhere. We see it, we talk about it, but as always, we as human beings, what can we do about it? The how is missing, actually. And Yuri, coming back to you, the how is most of the time missing. They see the what, but the how is missing. How do you see it?
Well, normally you can only get to a strong how after a solid why and what, right? And also the who is important, and the when, the timing, right? So it's all interrelated, but that's a very abstract reasoning. But in practice, the how. Now, first of all, I agree with Jan, right? So first I had to transform myself to have a deeper cellular level connection to ecological crisis and to help solve it, and also the social inequality crisis, right? And the way to do it, in my case, and it's personal for everybody, what worked for me, the how, is to do, let's say, out of comfort zone experiences in China, in India, in Peru, can be anywhere, maybe in Burning Man, but because these out of the comfort zone experiences allow you to reconnect to yourself, other people, and nature at a deeper level. And this allows you to focus more on these topics with energy, with light, with passion, your ikigai, your purpose, right? And that's the first step. In terms of the systemic how, it's quite close to that, right? I'm doing that. Jan is doing this as well, right? So we educate, transform leaders, right, in these spiritual journeys or vision quests. And these are fundamental for emerging leaders, current leaders, to let them experience what we have experienced ourselves. And that's the first step, right, in these massive transitions that we are entering in the next few decades. But at a very abstract level, I would say it's a combination of personal transformation. It's about changing your behaviors, your needs. I changed my needs as well, also because of Corona, the pandemic. It's about embracing new technologies which are in line with nature. So not mechanistic, but living technologies which give back to nature, not extract from nature, right? So quantum technologies, nanotechnology, biotechnology, biomimicry, photonics, right? Or evolving adaptive technologies that are in line with the principles of nature. That's also a big chunk. And it's also about, as Jan said, it's about critical mass, right? So it's a bottom-up self-organized movement globally. I'm very excited about Gen Z, millennials, because they are more in line with the stuff we talk about. They feel intuitively that we need to change the world, right? They have to live in that world. So they have self-interest besides the purpose to make this work.
Mhm.
So convergence of all these components, in my view.
Yeah, and connected with you went to India to experience another world, and you came back. Tell me more about that, because that's the connection with nature.
Yeah, that's a very powerful experience. It was the most transformative experience of my whole life. I'm gonna do it again in September. I told you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do that every year, once. So it's a full week journey on bare feet. Some of it. There's no shower, no bed. There's no food for 2 days for fasting. You walk into the poorest parts of India. You meditate 5 times a day in a small group, 30 men, and you basically transform your life. The first 2 days are about your past. The next 2 days are about the present. So you connect to nature at a deeper level, and the last 2 days are about your future, the purpose. So what happens basically, it's in sum, because it's a long story, but you become so present and connected inside yourself that you have a deeper connection with people, right? First of all. So it's not about empathy, it's something deeper than that, way deeper. But also I could talk to nature, I could interact with nature, ask questions, get answers, and it was just insane. It was all organic, there was no smartphone, there was no medicine whatsoever, so it's super pure. And then I realized, holy shit, I forgot about this, right, in my life. But it's real, right, for all the people in the group. And I want to share that experience, because then you know the way I saw myself in the past was wrong. It was very fragmented or one-dimensional, or what too much in the mind. So you really start living from the soul and the heart level, like fully aligned inside yourself. And as a result, you connect with nature, the wonder, the inner child experience you have when you are born. It's similar to that, right? So you reconnect to your inner child. And then you see the value, the beauty, the insane magnificence of nature and the universe, right? It's an existential feeling.
Do you think that all leaders should experience that?
Yeah, 100%. That's the most important thing that needs to be done, in my view, in the world today. First step. 100%.
Before I share the question in the chat of Robert, I also would like to ask Jan. He also experienced a journey on the South Pole. You went to the South Pole, did you?
Yeah. 4 years ago, I wanted to experience climate change myself, and in particular the impact it has on the Antarctic area. And that was really moving. I became emotional, because if you are part of that beautiful nature, you experience a few things. First of all, the absolute beauty of the icebergs and, let's say, the whole environment. Secondly, the fragility. It's so fragile that you realize that we should never ever destroy this. Thirdly, the silence. I'm a guy from the city, and I'm always used to noise in the background, and there was absolutely no noise. It was silent as I've never experienced, and that made me crying. And the combination with the polar researchers, I was lucky to have meetings with about 20 of those researchers, the best polar researchers in the world, and they were very emotional. They argued we are seeing things and observing things that we cannot account for. We have no theory or model that accounts for this rapid decay of the Antarctic ice shelf. So please tell it to the other people, because we feel isolated and we have hardly any reach. But that was a kind of a tragedy, and that combination was a life-changing experience in itself. And I was shocked that some of these researchers have been for decades there doing research, and they reached their own tipping point. One of them started crying and says, I cannot believe what is happening here, and I cannot believe that there is still not a feeling of urgency among many people in the world.
Mm.
And of course, you might argue that hundreds of millions of years ago, there was also no ice at the Antarctic ice shelf, but it goes now 1,000 times faster than natural. That's the point. And where I was at the fringes of Antarctica, it was 18 degrees. 18 degrees. That was a record. And 2 of the 3 dominant penguin species migrated already to the coldest areas at the South Pole. And that is a tragedy in itself. And it makes a difference if you feel it yourself in an intense manner, if you feel it at your heart. And that was also the reason why I became an activist. I call it a scientivist 15 years ago after my biking accident. Before that, I was a successful scholar, but I had a reach of about 1,000 people, not more than that. Now I'm trying to spread the word in the sense that we must restore the balance between humans and nature, because deep down inside, that is the big problem. We feel superior to nature, and we feel, let's say, morally that we, let's say, might destroy that nature. And we are borrowing from nature in terms of resources and exploiting them, but we don't pay back. And we know if you do that, you are building up your debts and you run into a crisis. So, yes, I always share these pictures. I cannot do that right now. I simply took them with my iPhone. And I always show them at my lectures, and it makes a deep impression to people. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. What I experienced, of course, in the beginning of this lockdown, what you see in the world, you have to stay at home, and there's no in 1 day or 2 days there's no smoke anymore in places like Delhi, in places like Hong Kong. You see the clear waters. So sometimes I'm thinking, is nature giving us a message? What do you think, both of that?
Yeah, what we call it at a systemic level, nature strikes back now. Because of that deep down disbalance, you see the implications. We are speaking of the Anthropocene. That is a new era in which you see the footprint of humans all over the world. And I always give 3 examples. First, the plastic soup, an area in the Great Ocean that is 35 times as big as the Netherlands, for instance. Secondly, the loss of biodiversity, which is actually, in my perception, the biggest problem. We are destroying nature. And thirdly, climate change. And all these symptoms are, let's say, symptoms of a deeper manifestation that nature is striking back. And let's say some philosophers call it that nature becomes not only a factor in our life, but an actor. So nature is more and more interwoven into our economy and society. And we cannot any longer ignore that. And that is fascinating. That also is true with regard to this crisis, the corona crisis. This is not an external factor. We are entering areas in Congo in order to deeply dive for cobalt, for instance, that we are using in our mobile phones. And we are in direct contact with animals that are carrying these zoonoses. So we are getting at places where we do not belong. And that is deep down inside the reason why there will be more pandemics if we continue with the lifestyle that we are now pursuing.
Robert, sorry for waiting. I share your question. Thank you for sharing your question. Coming back to leadership, is lack of personal transition leaders inhibiting international transition?
I would say yes. it's a more complicated issue, right? There's also immune system and the pressures surrounding these leaders, right? The systemic or the environmental issues, but it's also mostly a personal issue, or right? So the lack of personal transfer. As Jan has told us as well, and my own story, right? That's very convincing. At least I hope. Without these experiences, that you don't have the energy, the drive, the persistence, the grit, the focus to make it work, right? These are complicated issues, long term. The only way to keep on going is to have these personal transformation experiences at a deeper level. And I would say not once, but well, frequently, right? To keep yourself aligned, to know what's truly valuable and why you are doing this, right? You have to embody it, become it.
Yeah, I agree with Yuri. And for me, leadership in this, let's say, era of crisis, because I expect a concatenation of crisis, means that in each and every one of us is some potential leadership. We always look ahead and above, and we look at CEOs and CFOs, mostly disappointing. There's a lack of leadership, let's say, within multinationals, big companies, and that is for a good reason. These people are not selected for leadership times in crisis. Mostly, they are there in that position because they are solid and steady, and that is very difficult in times of transition. Real leadership, if you are leading a company, means that you are not restoring the old business, but take up the challenge for developing new business and also working on restoring your own balance between the company you are leading and the environment and the globe. And that is often lacking. So 9 out of 10 leaders of companies now are going back to business as usual. And that is going back to the normal. That was the reason for the imbalance. So that is exactly the opposite of the leadership that we need. So real leaders, they are, let's say, facing resistance and are taking unpopular measures and in order to, let's say, go to the next level. And of course, that leadership is around, but I see more leadership in society than in politics or, let's say, in companies. That is a serious problem.
Yeah. What I see, sorry, what I see the last couple of years, that we lose a little bit the mission of all what we do. We are changing to other generations of leadership. What I shared in the last webinar with Geest about co-elevation, I start with that mission and adding value with one another to co-create and help each other to move forward. Yeah, I think that should be the new leadership that we all desire, that we all want to do what we really feel to do. And coming back to nature then, I see here a question from Benjamin Butler. He asked us, do male leaders need to learn to cry? But I just ask you, do leaders need to learn to cry?
I would say yes. I think crying is about reconnecting to yourself at the soul level. It's about healing. It's beautiful. It's vulnerable. And as a result, the more personal you become, the more universal you become. So the connection to, let's say, your whole organization, your whole ecosystem will be, intensified. Well, your impact goes like 10x. Of course, you cannot cry every day or, let's say, all the time, but if it's authentic, if it's heartfelt, if it's unscripted, and it's about the purpose we are talking about, right? Then I think it's very powerful and also necessary in my view.
And how can we learn that, Jan?
Now, for example, Obama, right? He was crying after this crazy gun event, the shooting, right, with small kids. Mm-hmm. And I was like, yes, right, that's real leadership. right? It's okay to show that. He's not a machine. He's a human being, right?
But of course, you also see a lot of acting people, and you can also fake it. But
people are quite smart with that. Most people have a good sense of the bullshitters and the real people.
Yeah.
I think what we need is authentic and connecting leadership. And if you are faking that, then let's say the social media can easily destroy that. If you say yes and you act no, then these are difficult times. And you see that in times of crisis, many people long for, let's say, populist leaders. And you see that all the populist leaders are failing in how to deal with the corona crisis. Look at the United States, look at Brazil, many bad examples. You also see that female leaders are doing it better than male leaders. Look at New Zealand, look at Scandinavia, look at Germany. That's already a sign of the times. And if you are not connect your heart and your head and your hands, then you're out of sync within a short time. So authentic leaders are also afraid. Connecting leaders are also afraid. We all have that fear for real transformation, but they are so passionate and they are often visionary that becomes bigger than the fear they have. That is, most people think that these leaders are not afraid. That is a misconception. They are, but they have found something that, let's say, becomes so big that they can overcome their own fear. And I find it beautiful. To a certain extent, I'm also working myself on this.
Yeah.
Well, I know a few examples, right? I don't want to talk about negative things or leaders too much, right? So there also I've met quite a few positive leaders, right, in terms of climate sustainability purpose. The CEO of Statkraft, Feike Siebesma, the CEO of DSM, great guy, and also Johan Thijs, the CEO of KBC, top 7 CEO in the world. According to Harvard Business Reviews, and Paul Polman. People I've met in China who are amazing leaders, and even though in the Western media people don't realize that, but they are super purpose driven, most leaders in China, and that's very fascinating, right? So there are a lot of good examples as well across the world.
Is it possible? I think that's the question of Liam Lamping. Thank you for sharing. Using a symbiotic model, being part of a complex system that supports life on this planet. What is our weaknesses as human that needs to change in favor of a future without major climate change and pollution? And how do we confront humanity to accomplish a change? Thank you for this beautiful question. Jan.
Well, if you look at human beings, you can look at them as complex systems. If you look at companies, you can look at companies as complex systems. And you see the persistent problems mirrored in these companies and human beings. Companies are now driven, and we are part of that, by efficiency, by short-term goals, by return on investment, let's say in the shortest possible term. And if you do that, then you become very vulnerable to crisis and chaos. And so we are not shock-proof, we are not crisis-proof. Nature is handling in a different manner. Nature is diverse, nature is resilient, is efficient, but not only based on competition, also on cooperation. Nature, per definition, has stocks. And so we can learn a lot from nature. And the point is, we are not at war with a virus. We are at war with nature and with ourselves. So we as complex organic beings can learn a lot from the complexity of nature itself. That is the beauty. And you see more and more companies that are trying to learn and take these principles and, let's say, digest that into their culture and structure. And that is fascinating to see. That's not easy to implement, because then you should be able to change your dominant culture and structure and practices. And my experience is it takes already 10 years at least to change a culture, because then you need to change your underlying values and habits. But I see many companies on their way of becoming more nature-like, more organic, and we need to learn from that as human beings. We are in permanent disbalance. And an important reason for that is our, let's say, permanent drive to growth. I read a fascinating Dutch book lately about phantom growth, that we created the myth that we need to grow. And we are repeating it every day, but we grow at the cost of. We grow at the cost of nature, we grow at the cost of ourselves. In many countries, we have tripled our material welfare over the past 50 years. But if you measure the level of happiness, that remained more or less constant. It's actually somewhat decreasing. So we became 3 times richer in material terms, but in mental terms, we became a little poorer. How tragic is that? So we need to, let's say, break down that myth of endless growth.
And do you mean with growth, because it's the same when we pick sustainability, it's large. It's the same like leadership. It's very large. Do you mean growth every year, expanding profit and more consuming? More?
I mean growth, in particular, unlimited growth is measured by our GDP. That's the wrong measure, the wrong standard, because it includes, let's say, also the damage that we are creating, but it excludes, for instance, the ecological and social damage that we are creating. So it is really outdated. Then you have green growth. That is already an improvement. But you can also grow green in a wrong way. What we are doing now, for instance, to achieve our climate targets, we are largely producing biomass and even put biomass into our coal-fired plants. And that has nothing to do with creating a balance between humans and nature. It's only to achieve your CO2 reduction target. That's also the wrong way. We call it green growth, but it's also a form of old-fashioned growth. And then you have degrowth. That means not growing at all. That's quite radical. I can live with it, but I'm not per se against growth, as long as you do it in a balanced way. And then you have a fourth category, A growth, promoted by some enlightened economists. And that means that you start differentiating between balanced growth and unbalanced growth. So, and that is already an improvement. I'm in favor of the last one. There's a well-known Dutch professor, Jeroen van den Berg, who has produced interesting articles about A growth. And I think that becomes more and more manifest. Because if you radically say, we cannot grow, that's very difficult to comply with for companies. That's a too radical step. And I noticed over the past 35 years that you need to combine a radical goal with incremental steps. That's why I call it transition an evolutionary revolution. It is a radical change process, but in small steps, and now and then an upheaval. So if you want to change your life and lifestyle, it's better to do it in incremental steps than radically, because if you do it too radical, there's a high chance that you fall back.
Yes, thank you.
I can answer this question maybe in a different way. So the way I see it is that most of the problems in the world are a result of not knowing who you are in essence, right? So in the last, let's say, decades, we have found ways to externalize identity, individual, group, using technologies, right? Technologies make the invisible visible, right? And then shareable. So it's externalizing things, social phenomena, natural phenomena, psychological phenomena. And that's part of the problem, right? Because I realized that everything you would like to have is inside. All the answers are inside, all that you need are inside, or most of it, besides some food, maybe water, right? So if you have that humble, a more realistic view of yourself, you encounter or you engage with social inequality or ecological crisis in a different way, because you transform beyond your ego into something else, which allows you to help solve these issues, right? So for me, it's going inside first and then outside as a key weakness, looking at this question.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I also would like to add something. A personal transition also goes in different phases. First, you become conscious of the fact that you need to change, but you still see many barriers. Then you are trying to overcome some of these barriers, and you see already a kind of perspective, but that's still a difficult phase. Then you might turn a breakthrough. And then you are going to, let's say, through it in an unconscious manner. So, and that might take already 10 years for an individual. So, yeah, still. And some people will never reach, let's say, the unconscious stage. So they might end up with a kind of a lock-in. So it's also a highly non-linear process I experienced. So the same holds for companies and for social systems. So it is a struggle, but it's worthwhile. We need to go through it. But each different person needs to take his or her own route. You cannot prescribe that. You cannot read that or learn that from booklets. You need to experience that yourself. So it's very, let's say, urgent that we do not do that only as individuals, but also as groups, let's say as communities, that we can learn from each other. And that is one of the ways out, I see. This is the time of the social movements. The social movements cannot be stopped. They are sharing values, they have particular goals, and they are purpose-driven. You can always stop or block an institution or an organization or a company or a state, but you can never, ever stop a social movement. We see that now with Black Lives Matter. We see that with the Me Too movement. We see that with the climate movement. So we need a similar kind of movement in order to restore the disbalance, the balance between nature and humans. I've done some fascinating research into social movement. There's a lot to be learned from that.
And what do we need to keep that movement going on? Because the movement creates changes in the world. Right?
Well, Jan?
You first.
Okay, so I've realized, that was a year ago, I was at a festival called Gardens of Babylon, and I heard about it, and they meditate as a collective before they go partying, right, for 1 hour. And I was like, now let's see, right? And then what happened, the party was like 10x more beautiful than normal, right? So then we decided that you talk about how to do this. Now we created this movement called Conscious Learning Tribe in the last 3 months, Rudic and I and me, and we all our sessions open with a meditation, collective meditation, and a closing meditation, always. And the energy always shifts. And all the people notice that, the participants, the audience, the speakers, ourselves, the organizing team. So there's something there, right? And I saw also these collective meditation, global meditations, sessions in the last 3 months during Corona, right? 100,000 people, or 500,000 in some cases. That's amazing, right? You just feel the energy online. Can you imagine if it's offline? So I think this becomes a big chunk of the next few years, right? Of this transformation. I'm convinced about that.
I think that's connects what you experience in nature and Jan on South Pole. The noise around us is unbelievable that you experience suddenly no noise. So really that Vikas Mankani last webinar was saying, okay, you are born with a mind, and then you create your mind during your journey, and it's your journey that takes you somewhere. But still, we must listen to our own feeling. Coming back to my journey, I finished my university degree in the same city, Maastricht, like Jan did. I think we are not a bit at the same age, are we, Jan?
I don't think so. You are much older.
Yeah, but during my journey at the university, I thought I must finish it in 4 years' time, and then I want to travel the world. It was 20 years ago now. I'm 45. And I only had two goals. Who am I and how do other people see me? So I was really connected with nature in Australia, in New Zealand, in Asia. And then you come back and you see that it was a standstill for me. That people, when you walk into the first bar, that the people were still standing in the same groups, on the same spots. They look at you and they say, "I'm Maurice," as if it was 1.5 years traveling. So what's happening? I think people must more feel and do. And now it's all coming about doing. And we will take this journey about, okay, our children. Yuri and I have children about the same age. It starts there, is it, Jan? You have, how many children do you have?
72. No, I'm kidding. Two, and they are in the 20s. So they are my most critical friends. They say, "Dad, in 35 years, you didn't book a lot of progress, isn't it?" And I say, "Well, quite a lot has changed since then, in terms of consciousness, in terms of change in attitude. We are now in the most difficult phase, changing our behavior. We are living in times of chaos. They can handle chaos much better than we. You cannot handle chaos in a rigid manner. You need to do that in a flexible, resilient manner." But they also say one important thing. "Okay, Dad, we appreciate everything that you have been trying, but we begin where you end. We are not going to talk about it any longer. We are not going to organize meetings. It's all about action." They are completely in the action mode. Last year, 6 million youngsters went on the streets in order to fight for a better climate policy. I never, ever have thought that when I started my career. So there are now different kind of social disruptors that undermine, let's say, our society and leads to an even greater chaos. We have the increasing inequalities, social inequalities and economic inequalities. We have a losing faith in our democracy and in our leaders. And we have, let's say, ecological disruptors, like climate change and loss of biodiversity that makes a lot of people nervous. And this becomes, let's say, a kind of, poisoning cocktail. So that is the reason why we need to, let's say, prepare ourselves for even more chaos. And therefore, we need each other. It's very difficult to handle that on your own. And we need each other because this will be a difficult but rewarding journey. I'm remaining optimistic after all these years because I see that we need apparently those crises, but we also need each other. And that's even more painful in this pandemic crisis. The 1.5 meter society is very unnatural. We need each other. We are coming from a long way from an era of Homo economicus. We are not simply only Homo economicus. We are also Homo sociologicus or ecologicus. We are many different pieces composing it to a whole unity. So we need each other in these social movements. And like I liked what Yuri described. I've also similar experiences. The most successful social movements had particular goals. They had leaders, but also they had rituals, ceremonies, very important, music, symbols, and they had common values. That's all we need. And you find joy among each other, but also hope. And that's what we need. Never ever a transition has been realized from pessimism or cynicism, always from hope and positive energy.
Yeah, last year I shared with the first president of Europe, Herman van Rompuy, my idea of one Europe, that we must more listen to each other cultures. Is there a culture at the moment where we can learn from, to learn from those rituals? Is it India? Because I'm really fascinated about India, Yuri.
That's a great question. I would like to give a more generic answers, right, which is also part of Conscious Learning Tribe, because in our purpose statement is we want to learn from the value and the values of ancient cultures globally, right? Because if we combine that with the power of our emerging living technologies, we can help transform the world, right? And our mindset, as we talked about earlier. So the value of ancient cultures, it can be the Incas, the Mayas, or the Aboriginals, or an African tribes. Of course, there are differences, or the Indians. The commonality, in my view, also based on my experience, partially, is that they meditate 3 times a day, they pray, they have social inclusion by default in their genes and minds and hearts, and they connect to nature organically, always, or almost always. So, and I think that's coming back, right? I see a resurgence, revitalization of the value of ancient cultures, especially in my personal network in the last few years, right? People like Loïc Lemur, even people from Silicon Valley, in China, in India, and the tech people, the tech startup entrepreneurs, the pioneers, they all are doing this right now, right? And they connect, they talk about this stuff. So I think that's coming back, and it's partially based in Chinese wisdom from thousands of years ago, and they still practice that. In India, same storyline, thousands of years ago, the wisdom, right? And but it's also in other places in the world, and it can also be Costa Rica, right, who is doing amazing things in terms of sustainability and climate, right? As a pioneer. It can be Colombia in particular ways, right? So there's a lot of things are happening across the world. That's hopeful.
Yeah, beautifully said. I like that. The title of this seminar was, let's say, how to restore the balance between humans and nature, because we are now actually in a disbalance. What we can learn from these indigenous people and these cultures, they are living in permanent balance between nature and themselves. That's the beauty. And we lost that. and therefore, we need to go back to our roots, in a sense, in a modern, innovative way. But this is the essence. This is our deep, basic feeling that we lost, and that's what we can learn. And it's such a pity that we lost that in our growth for, let's say, obsessive development.
And Jan, by the way, what's interesting, these people were more happy or happier than, let's say, the average Western person I've met in my life.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was walking in the slums in Old Delhi and a couple of years ago, and I was approached by an old fellow, and I held my hand against my breast in order to protect my wallet. And he approached me and said, "Why are you afraid for?" I said, "Well, that I'm being robbed here. Nobody will steal your money," he said, "because you seem to be materially rich, but mentally poor. Here, we are mentally rich and materially poor. Okay, he was in the 70s. I was at a fairly young stage. I was silent, and I kept silent. And he was so right, so deep to the essence, that I became emotional.
We can learn from that when I see this question of Ulrike de Jong, what would be the future measures instead of GDP?
Well, if I can do a take, Jan.
Yeah.
So I think it's happiness. It's about well-being.
Is it more joy than happiness?
Yeah,
joy is a choice.
That's,
happiness is a result of something what you're doing.
Yeah, but let's say joy. Yeah, joy. I would say I would be a massive fan. I just realized if there would be an inner child index, right? So if you do a survey, whatever, once a month or a CBS or in Holland or every quarter, like, okay, do you feel connected? Do you feel your inner child right now? Right, that's a very good cue for different things, positive things in life. Because if you are connected to yourself, you're more social, more productive, more happy, right? So I would say that, and also more ecological KPIs. Now, Jan can talk about that in more detail, I would say. So, so social, ecological, self, yeah. But probably also something about the universe. That's the next episode, Beyond Nature, in my view. So a lot of stuff is happening in space, and we will discover amazing things in the next few years, I'm convinced. And so that becomes the next generation KPI, I would say.
A couple of years ago, I was in Bhutan, and they are measuring the level of happiness in Bhutan. And they also have a minister of happiness. And the way they do that is fascinating. Each year, they ask people in their country to write down, let's say, the real value of relationships with their family, friends, and so on. And based on, let's say, these filled in lists, they measure the level of happiness. And they are also steering on that. In terms of, let's say, giving money and dividing it, they are taking that. And that's a very interesting experiment. One of the few countries that dares to do that. And why not?
Yeah, why not? That is a very good question. Why not? And it is my second question with that is, how do they? What makes those people happy? Is it then giving back to nature? Coming back to our topic, is every human being then doing something that gives back to this nature? Because we are living on this planet, and a lot of people think we are the owner of this planet, but we have to take care for this planet, right?
Yeah, you see that back in Bhutan. First of all, their level of happiness springs from, let's say, the quality, the amount, the beauty of their friendships. Friendships with family, with friends, with relatives, but also with themselves in the way they are connected. And secondly, the way they deal with nature. They are very prudent and cautious with, let's say, inviting tourists. It's still quite expensive, and they only want to bring in a limited amount of tourists. Otherwise, they are afraid of what happened elsewhere, like in Tibet or in other countries or Nepal that have been overwhelmed by tourists at the cost of nature. And that is one of the lessons they learned. Very interesting.
Yeah, to talk about nature, coming back to this part of the world. I want also make a jump into the retail industry. I'm living in Belgium. I saw some people joining us from Belgium, Antwerp, and thank you for being here. I know there's a supermarket here called Colruyt. It's a huge supermarket, except from they call it here Jumbo instead of Jumbo, and Albert Heijn is coming in growing really fast in Belgium. But there's still a coal right, and they are now busy. Where's the help people, help your client where the food is coming from? Do you see that it must be a goal of supermarkets to show your clients where food is coming from?
I can build on that. I just heard it yesterday. I didn't realize that there's a company called an online supermarket called Picnic in Holland.
Michiel Muller.
Yeah, quite successful. And he's working with Plant Lab, which is a vertical farm or in our solution. So they have a decentralized model, right? So local production of food and just the local supermarket, short supply chain, better for your climate, less travel. That's the future, right? So I foresee a future of vertical farming at the restaurant level, the household level, increasingly. And right now you have these huge vertical farming spots like the Bowery, for example, or Plenty or Aero Farms, but it will decentralize, democratize over time. So yeah.
And closer to nature, what I mean, that people really know, okay, we have to eat healthier food, and no sugar, and know where it's coming from. Like, for example, Tony Chocolonely, it's a chocolate without slavery. Jan, what is your opinion about it?
Well, the most prominent sector where we see the disbalance between human and nature is the food sector. Mm-hmm. The whole food chain has been, let's say, disrupted because we want to make it more efficient to keep. And we in the Netherlands are also a big owner of that problem. We are the, let's say, second biggest food exporter in the world after the United States. For such a small country, that is a miracle. So 80% of the food we are producing, we are exporting. But we are also importing 80% of our food. That is crazy. That is crazy. We are importing almost 1 million calves from other European countries into our country. We make in a very fast way meat of it, and then we are exporting it. That is absolutely crazy. An average small piece of yogurt travels 30,000 kilometers across Europe. That is insane. Yeah. That is insane. And one of the answers to this crisis is that we are producing and consuming more at a regional scale, let's say 50 by 50 kilometers. That we don't do it any longer in such an insane manner, and that we feel where the food is coming from. Why should we export all that food and not even consume that ourselves? Nobody can give you the answer. It's absolutely madness. So this is our entrance to the new regional economy, where we become less dependent on other countries and become a bit more autonomous. And that does not only hold for food, but also for energy and for making things in the manufacturing industry. It is absolutely weird that 90% of our medicine comes from India and China, or even the masks. Come on, you know? And that is part of the new circular and digital economy. If possible, we can do it ourselves.
Yeah, Elias always said, support your local. Your locals love it. Of course, support your locals. But then a step further, you see more and more people eating no meat anymore. You see more and more people doing it themselves in their own garden. That's also a movement, is it, Yuri?
Yeah, it's a big movement, the self-sufficiency.
Don't forget the strawberries who are growing here.
Yeah, yeah that's a big one. That's an inside joke, yeah. So anyway, I think this will intensify, right, for economic reasons, social reasons, technological reasons, allowing this to happen, right, in the next few years already, or today, and also a way to be resilient, right, anti-fragile, become less dependent on global supply chains with new pandemics or other crises, right? So you want to have a sense of resilience, right? To and do it more stuff yourself at the community level. And Jan knows a lot about that. He's been doing this, telling this for 10 years. So yeah, maybe you can share your perspective on the numbers, right? Because it's really growing, right?
Yeah, to give you an indication, Yuri, the number of flexitarians is growing explosively all over Europe, also in the Netherlands. Flexitarians eat 2 or 3 times less meat per week. If you do that 1 year long, you save as much as CO2 as if you would not drive a car for a year. So food production is one of the most energy and CO2 intensive sectors that we know of. And more than 65% of the Dutch people now are claiming that they are flexitarian. I lately was in a flexitarian restaurant in Rotterdam. That's at the Kop van Zuid, as we call it, for Intimi. And they serve you a big plate with vegetables. In my case, 5 types of beans, and a very small plate with fish or meat. And they explain you why they do it. Mm-hmm. And lots of people are visiting that restaurant. And there's a kind of a revolution taking place in the food sector, also in terms of the restaurants. That as in, let's say, the big cities like Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht, it is already difficult to get an original piece of meat, let's say. It's mostly organic, sustainable, biological, what have you. You see that all over the world. And also this one is driven by social movements. One of the most effective social movements is the slow food movement. Slow food. And even McDonald's is changing their primary business case. They are really heading for more organic, green, salad kind of food. And their burgers within a couple of years will be not meat burgers, but let's say all kind of substitutes for that. And that they are already experimenting with that. But the slow food movement that started originally in Italy had an enormous impact.
And is it again the connection with teaching, educating people what health food is? I did a course, but it's not branded in the supermarket. This is health food, and be careful with this food.
I think the biggest driver for this is Netflix. Let me explain. So a lot of people have Netflix globally, still growing. And you have these documentaries about food, right? About diaries or meat and all this stuff. That has a huge impact globally, also on me, right? So that's for me the reason to cut meats, let's say 95%, and dairy as well, let's say 50% at least. So I think that's undervalued to the importance of entertainment services like Netflix, documentaries. Yeah.
And food.
Yeah, I agree with that. But underlying is a cultural shift. Mm-hmm. I investigated once the shift from smoking to non-smoking. Believe it or not, but 40, 50 years ago, you would have seen us smoking in our own rooms. 90% of the adult people smoked that time. If you did not smoke, you was not very social and not very, let's say, into others. So it was a kind of a natural habit to smoke. And then a very small group of people stopped smoking because they heard about the relations with lung cancer. They infected an even bigger group. And then, let's say, you saw the rising of the fitness, the gyms, and the rising impact of health. Health became more and more important in our lives. That was 30 years, a period. And only after 30 years, the government came with all kinds of restrictions. So it took 50 years to go through that shift. Now only, let's say, a little more than 20% of the people is smoking, very unevenly distributed among the population. But it was not particularly because of the government restrictions, but it was a shift in culture, group by group by group. And then the government prohibited it in working places and airplanes and what have you. And that helps, but it was not the primary case. And you see all kind of similarities between that transition from smoking to non-smoking and the food transition. That also creeps into our culture. Because if you are a smoker now, I'm sorry for those who still do that, you are kind of a loser. And if you are, let's say, going to McDonald's in 10, 15 years from now, you also will be seen as a kind of a loser. And if you don't have solar panels in the future, you are also kind of a loser. That is how transitions, let's say, creep into our thinking and acting and culture.
And I think the same will happen with pieces of pharma, right? Pieces of medicine. Yeah. The same is happening.
Yeah. Connecting with that, okay, the government suddenly forbids that you are not allowed to smoke anymore in bars and other places. Then the question of Sietse Smith, thank you for that, is should meat consumption be actively discouraged by governments, for example, by means of higher taxes or as human transitioning, a very long question, fast enough towards vegetarian, flexible, so move that way?
Yes.
Should that be doing the government?
The answer is yes.
Yes. Tell me.
Also, from a financial point of view, it's better for the government by more prevention.
That's what the government wants to hear, of course.
Yeah, you've seen that also with smoking. It became 5 or 10 times more expensive. And you see that, I think that kind of taxing bad habits, let's say, let's call it bad for nature and for ourselves, that will be the norm for the next decades. We are going to tax, let's say, meat, but also traveling, airplane traveling, mobility by cars, in particular gasoline cars. So you will see that all over the place. The only point is, if you do not do that in a clever, smart way, the poorer people will become the victims. So you need to do that in a socially fair way. Otherwise, let's say, the rich people will get away with it, and the poor people will become the victim. That is where the opposition comes from now, but it will be unavoidable.
So it's the right time doing that for the government, because you can earn a lot of money with it if you know how to do it. That's one. The funny thing is, I want to share an example in my life story. On a Friday, my wife decided from Monday we are not eating meat again. And I don't get me wrong, I love meat. I love to eat meat. So I have 2 younger children, 8 and 10. Jan and Yuri know that. And you see the children is just doing this. Okay, mom decides not to eat meat, and it's of course in the beginning a little difficult for me. She's a flight attendant for KLM, and when she's away, then you think, okay, I'll put the pizza again or do something else. But it's little steps, and then you see children are more easier with that. I think I saw a question of, and let me scroll a little bit, of Leon, was it? How can we involve young people and bring them close to nature and make them more conscious, so more about, okay, what's health food? I think it's a great question for you.
Yeah, Yuri knows about this, but I have a funny example. Unilever has developed an education program for young people. So they more or less gave up on our generation, let's say 40, 50 plus, and they had a smart strategy. They came across all kind of education programs in schools, and they developed education programs for, let's say, the youngest children between 4 and 12 years. And the idea was that these children, which became aware of, let's say, the unsustainable behavior, discussed that at the dinner table with their parents. So the indirect impact of that was much bigger than directly approaching these adults. And I think that's a kind of a brilliant approach to impact and influence that through young people, which are far more conscious than we are. My children are vegetarians. I'm more flexitarian. I still love now and then eating a piece of meat. So isn't that fascinating?
Yuri.
Well, yeah, I come back to my first point. Actually, I'm initiating this in Holland already right now. What I see, a lot of young people have issues, mental issues, right? It's 2x, 4x more than 15 years ago, 1.5. So anxiety, depression, loneliness, it's pretty awful. So
Generations, is it?
yeah, and a way to solve that is, in my view, based on my own experience, to let them reconnect, let them walk into nature for 1 week every year, right? So right now I'm investigating all these routes across Holland. And my dream is in the next 10 years, and I know it will happen by me or somebody else, doesn't matter, this becomes totally ingrained in the educational system, probably already in the next 5 years. So all pupils, all young people will have to walk into nature when they're up to it in terms of age and physical capability. Go into nature, no smartphone, meditation, right? The stuff I have experienced, but in a lighter way. I think that's because then you will also solve these issues, right, of disconnection, anxiety, and depression to a certain or full degree. And I think that this is it's low cost, right? It's just a decision, and the timing is perfect for this right now.
Yeah, I fully agree. I know of a famous Belgian psychiatrist, Paul Verhaag, and he is investigating, let's say, the explosive growth in depressions and mental health diseases among young people. And he says that is also related to the imbalance between humans and nature and the unprecedented growth paradigm. So we have been teaching them to be ready for competition and growth. And that puts an enormous pressure on them in combination with the social media that, let's say, forces you to express yourself in the most ideal way, which is all superficial, he claims. So in themselves, there's also a disbalance between the way they exposing themselves and the way they really feel. And the amount of mental diseases and depressions and people in the 20s and 30s have been exploding by 200% over the last decade. That is a serious signal. That is the most serious signal that we are out of balance. In my generation, that did not happen or occur. That you are 25 and that you felt depressed. Of course, there were also, let's say, incidents, but not structurally. And that is a serious symptom. So he says we live in a diseased society. And we are making people sick. We are forcing them, let's say, to grow and expose themselves, putting a lot of pressure. And I have lots of students. And then I ask them, where does that pressure come from? And the social media play a very, very bad role in this. But also the pressure we put on them and they put on themselves. If you are starting a study these days, you need to finish it in 4 years. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Why should you finish your study in 4 years? I did it in 6.5 years, and I took my time to experience life, experience myself, experience my limits and possibilities. But it's far beyond getting your grade, you know. And that is, again, the efficiency, tendency. You need to study in a highly efficient way. Why? Come on. This should be the time of your life. You have no children normally at that time. You can experience a lot of things. Enjoy.
I want to build on that, Jan, because if I look back in my college or student or university years, I was studying for 6 years, but I studied 4 or 5x more optional subjects than mandatory.
Yeah.
And I wrote a book about China as a student, right, with 3 other students, and both have transformed my life right now massively, right? I'm fully into China, but And the book, which is now Exponential Organizations, is a full derivative of that curiosity moment during my university. If I had to be efficient back then, I wouldn't be in China. I couldn't write this book, right? It's the top 10 business book of all times, right? So we need slack, we need fuzziness, messiness, we need redundancy in our lives, in our professions, in our educational systems.
Yeah, you need to get lost.
Yeah, we got that. Yeah,
and very good that you get lost now and then.
It's awful. It's not human. It's inhuman, but it's also unproductive, because then you only get incremental innovations, not bold innovations, because the imagination is being killed, right, to a certain degree.
Radical innovations goes along with transitions and always lead to failure. But you won't be remembered by your failures. You will be remembered by your successes. Out of the 10 radical innovations I started, 6 or 7 failed. Now and 3 or 4 succeeded. And I'm more proud of that than if 10 out of 10 would have succeeded, because perhaps then they were not radical enough.
And yeah, of course, coming back to the different cultures about failures. We all know that when we are having a failure in the Netherlands, for example, people turn their back. When you have failures in America, they are proud of you, but you have to stand up again and learn from it. How can we create that movement? That failures is good. I think it starts at school, is it? Jan, for you, that question is really for you.
Yeah, I always tell children, but also students, you should be rewarded if you fail.
Yeah.
What we do now at our education system is we reward children if they don't make failures. That is absurd, because we are now heading for a society and an economy in which uncertainty and risk becomes the norm. If you need to deal with uncertainties, in particular structural uncertainties, so the things that you know that you don't know, or you don't know that you don't know, you need to experiment at a small scale. Because if you start at a too big scale and then fail, then it might, let's say, become dramatic. So you need to do searching, learning, experimenting, and you need to be rewarded for doing that. So searching, learning, experimenting should be a key pillar, let's say, in our future education system.
I like it.
But we are now, let's say, teaching children to make as little as errors as possible, but also we try to teach them how to be in control. And we are not in control anymore, we know that. And also that there is a kind of path of continuity. And we know that we are facing an era of discontinuity and disruption. So it goes at 3 different levels then, that we need to teach those children how to deal with the deepest uncertainties, how to deal with discontinuities, and also how to deal with failures. Failure is a symptom of progress.
You learn from it.
You learn from it. And you cannot, let's say, the whole idea that there is a continuous pathway now for youngsters in the next 50 years is ridiculous. And we had that classical idea that you learn 20 years at school and then a 40-year career and then go with pension. That is the old linear economy. That's not valid anymore. It is constantly learning, searching, experimenting. Young people are prepared for 10 different jobs. So it's much more circular. So the whole idea at school should also be circular driven.
I want to build that, Maurice, because there are amazing companies, or in that sense, in my view, like Procter & Gamble, Tata, and even Cisco for 5 to 10 years already. They have heroic failure awards, right? So that's a big deal if you fail in a unique way as an employee or a team, and You get promoted, you get a bonus, and you get highlighted by the global CEO at the largest annual employee event, right? So that's the way to, when you want to change a culture, you have to change the KPIs, right? You get what you incentivize, right? So, and they did it, and after a few years, it worked, right? We can do the same in Holland, right? On educational systems. It's just a very simple idea, heroic failure awards.
And you can learn from it. Can we also do that, implement that in the government system already?
Of course, yeah, but of course you have.
That's much.
You have to talk about it.
Now, when you see that in the current crisis, you see we are led now by medical specialists, and they do that tremendously. But there's one characteristic of medical experts, and I know that because I've worked within 10 years within the RIVM, the National Health and Environment Institute in the Netherlands. There's one characteristic: they are risk aversive in everything. Go to your doctor, he will be risk aversive. And that comes out of fear. In particular in the United States, you will be sued if you take too much risk as medical specialist. And out of a medical standpoint, that is to be, let's say, appreciated. But it's not a very wise guiding characteristic for our society to be risk aversive. And that is the reason why we initiated that breakout team, because you need to look from a broader perspective. See what I mean? Being risk aversive is only one of the many forms that you have.
And talk about what you're saying. It's getting the fear away from children who are growing in that new, but for all generations it exists. Let it go. But then a second thing, I think we have 5 more minutes and then 90 minutes. A second thing is we don't learn to collaborate. There's always competition, and it starts at school. Yuri.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's changing slowly. I was thinking about this CDC comment that Jan made before, right? The RIVM and the doctors and how they perceive failure. But I think going back to the first point in this good conversation today, they have a false sense of identity and a false sense of external security or certainty, which is the fundamental problem, that their self-view is fragmented and not true at all, right? But because I know if you are connected to yourself, then there is no failing. Actually, in India, when I was failing, I was even happier. I was laughing more, like the Dalai Lama, right? Now, that's a muscle that we can all train. I'm not saying like I'm enlightened, but that's not true. But it's a muscle that we can all train. And even the doctors can learn that, or kids, right? It starts with intention. If we want to make this work, we can move really fast in just a few years, right? It's not expensive. It doesn't cost anything in most cases. It's just about, do we want to make this work? Who's doing the first step?
So
if you look at the education of medical specialists, that's quite reductionistic. It's not holistic at all. When I got my biking accident, I broke almost everything in my face. And there were 4 different specialists looking at the different parts. Now, one to the brains, one to the eyes, and one to the teeth, and one to the jaws. And I was only concerned about the whole, because my face did change. And I say, who of you is taking at the whole picture? Nobody, they said. Well, that was quite a bad illustration. They focus reductionistically on the parts and not on the whole. And that's what we need also in the education system.
Finally, I think the biggest, and also this part of the buitenboord motor, but the revamp the educational system in Holland, the biggest omission right now, in our view, is a lack of purpose, or awareness of purpose in each individual pupil. Because if you found your purpose at an early age, guess what? You embrace failure more easily. You don't give up. You have grit and persistence, and you even anticipate failure because you have a purpose. And it should be difficult, otherwise your purpose is too small, right? And young people, they realize this, right? My kids, they realize this. My son is 7 years old. He has a purpose, right? And he's more curious than ever before. And he's failing, right? And it's great. And we celebrate that.
Yeah.
And I think that below that, if you look at output and input, I've always learned to value and give feedback on my kids in terms of inputs, always. So when they have output, let's say in AAA, and they didn't do anything, I become upset. But also the reverse. They did their best, they failed, I give them something special, right? So, and that's also part of the educational system, right? It's so standardized, commoditized, output-based, grade-based. It should also be about motivation, about effort, right? We don't measure that.
But I would like to end up in an optimistic mode, because we are both optimistic, Yuri and I. And I see a lot of changes in the education system as well. There are hundreds of schools in the Netherlands, but also in Europe and outside, that are doing radical experiments with how to teach children in a more holistic manner, for instance. And my basic message is the paradox. We stumble from one crisis to another crisis, but we learn from it. We need those crises in order to go to an entirely different society and economy. And after all these years, I'm still optimistic that we will manage to do that. And so that was my basic message today. And I think that Yuri reasons along the same kind of lines. Yeah, that's what connects us.
Yuri, last words for you, and then
Well, connect to yourself, find your purpose, connect with the same like-minded people, and you can do magical things in just a few months, right?
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for having you here in this 90 minutes. It was, time flies when you're having fun. I always say, what I learned is that we must, every country must have a minister of failure and a minister of purpose. And for the rest, we don't need any ministers anymore. I think at the moment there are many movements going on in a very positive way. You see that I'm connected with so many people around the world. The only thing is that we must share that. We must share these great examples, what is happening. Please put the light on those beautiful movements, the positive thing, and learn from it. Start your own movement in a good way. Like join Jan and Yuri in their movement in the Netherlands. We all can do it, but we cannot do it alone. I experienced that in a lot of webinars. We are not an individual that can change the world. We are human beings. And it's not female world of male world. We are human beings, and we can learn from each other. And we must solve the problems in a very global way. To connect with that and to help you with sharing your story, that will be on Thursday, 2:00. We launch a new next webinar, next power webinar with Chris Baldwin and me, myself, and I learn from speakers and purpose-driven speakers. And we go a little masterclass of 90 minutes, helping you to get the fear away and to speak in public, to how become a more powerful speaker, but it's more on how can you share your story and create that movement. Jan, thank you for having you for the first time. Thank you for all your inspiration, no words. Yuri, the same. Thank you again. And thank you everyone for engaging. Thank you for the questions. And I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.